to go out in the snow. Well, life is full of problems, like snow in the middle of October. And the truth is that all of us have our share of problems, don't we? Especially in Minnesota with the cold winds of winter looming before us. All across the world with the unemployment rate still being so threateningly high. It's just a fact that life has always been full of problems. It's not just this year. And so it shouldn't be any surprise to any of us that the Bible is also full of stories about people with problems, and especially about how those problems relate to our relationship with God. In fact, you could even say that the Bible is really about one problem in particular. What will God do about people? That's us. The crowning achievement of God's creation, who have rebelliously turned away from God's leadership and asserted our own stubborn rebellion and prideful self-control. That's the problem. And we call that problem sin. And sin has been plaguing us pretty much since almost the very beginning of creation. And really, as we read the Bible, the same problem just keeps repeating over and over and over again, starting in the garden with Adam and Eve, moving on down the line from Cain to Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Joseph, and all of Joseph's descendants who settled in the land of Egypt. And it's those people, Joseph's descendants, who we read about in the book of Exodus. They were made slaves eventually by their hosts in Egypt. And in the Bible account we're reading now, they're crying out to God for deliverance. It took 400 years for God to call Moses to deliver his people from slavery. But finally, after that 400 years and after enduring the 10 plagues on Egypt, Pharaoh and the other leaders relent. And they let Moses lead the Israelites on the Exodus, the leaving of slavery in Egypt. But you know, life, being what it is always full of problems, so they're barely away from their captors before they encounter more problems. I invite you to read along with me about some of these problems in Exodus chapter 14. We're going to start in verse 5. We're not going to be reading the full account, just the first, verse 5 through 12 or so. This is on 108 in your blue Bible if you'd like to follow along. When the king of Egypt was told that the people had fled, Pharaoh and his officials changed their mind about them and said, "What have we done? We've let the Israelites go. We've lost their services." So he had his chariot made ready and took his army with him. He took 600 of the best chariots, along with all the other chariots of Egypt, with officers over all of them. The Lord hardened the heart of Pharaoh, king of Egypt, so that he pursued the Israelites, who were marching out boldly. The Egyptians, all Pharaoh's horses and chariots, horsemen and troops, pursued the Israelites and overtook them as they camped by the sea near Pi-Hahiroth, opposite Baal-Zephon. As Pharaoh approached, the Israelites looked up, and there were the Egyptians marching after them. They were terrified, and they cried out to the Lord. They sound familiar? They cried out to the Lord. They said to Moses, "Was it because there were no graves in Egypt that you brought us to the desert to die? What have you done to us by bringing us out of Egypt? Didn't we say to you in Egypt, 'Leave us alone. Let us serve the Egyptians'? It would have been better for us to serve the Egyptians than to die in the desert." for most of us. The most memorable part of that account happens some verses later, right? Not the part we just read, not the complaining, but God's miraculous parting of the Red Sea. You know, it's important to stop and remember that for every miracle that we read about in the Bible, like the parting of the Red Sea, there was always a superabundance of problems surrounding the miracle. In fact, God's power is always displayed in the midst of our problems. And actually, always in the midst of God's people like you and me. And so, even though our lives are always full of problems, the good news is that God works through and redeems our problems, both for our salvation and for the salvation of the world and the glory of God's kingdom. There is never a question about whether God can redeem our suffering. The question is always this: how are we going to respond? How are we going to respond to God? How are we going to respond to each other and people outside of our community in the midst of our problems? Are we going to choose to be stupid, or are we going to choose to be faithful? Will we respond with wishful thinking or with faithful confidence in God? Are we going to respond with passive avoidance or with faithful action? Those are the questions. Let's watch now the first of two brief video clips from the Ten Commandments movie. This is Cecil B. DeMille's classic with Charlton Heston. And as we watch, I would invite you to ask yourself, how might you have responded to this problem?
Look! Pharaoh's chariot! We're trapped against the sea. Look!